The steel kitchen counters gleamed under the harsh white lights, reflecting the chaos that was a Friday night service. It was hot, incredibly hot, the kind of heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin and the air feel heavy enough to chew on. Every surface was vibrating. The massive stove fans roared like jet engines, drowning out the clatter of metal pots hitting metal trays. Amidst all this noise and steam stood Thomas. He didn't look like a man who was panicking. He looked like a statue carved from granite. Completely still in the center of a hurricane, Thomas was the head chef here, and tonight, the weight on his shoulders was heavier than the massive stock pots boiling in the corner. It wasn't just the full booking of the dining room that had the kitchen staff running around like headless chickens. It was the news that had traveled through the waitstaff just minutes before the doors opened. Anton Eds was here. If you worked in the food industry, that name was enough to make your stomach drop. Anton Eads wasn't just a food writer. He was the judge, jury, and executioner of fine dining. He was a man who could taste a soup and tell you not only what herbs were in it, but the region they were grown in and the mood of the farmer who picked them. He was known for being cruel but fair, precise to a fault, and terrifyingly influential. A good review from Eads meant lines around the block for a year. A bad review meant you were looking for a new job by the end of the month. Thomas wiped his hands on his white apron, leaving a faint smear of oil. He looked at the large silver clock on the wall. It was time. He picked up a pair of tweezers and leaned over the final plate. It was a simple dish, but deceptively so. A single, perfect scallop, sourced from the icy waters of the north, seared until it was golden brown on the outside and raw and sweet on the inside. It sat on a bed of pureed peas, bright green like a spring lawn, dotted with tiny yellow flowers and a foam made from saffron. It looked like a jewel. It smelled like the ocean and the earth combined. "Table 4, Thomas said, his voice low, but cutting through the noise of the kitchen. "Going now." The plate was placed on the counter. The waiter, a young guy named Ben, whose hands were shaking slightly, grabbed the silver tray. He looked at Thomas with wide eyes, as if asking for protection. Thomas just gave a small, sharp nod. That nod meant, "Don't drop it, and don't look scared." Ben took a deep breath, turned on his heel, and disappeared through the swinging double doors that separated the pristine quiet of the dining room from the hot madness of the kitchen. As soon as the doors swung shut, the air in the kitchen changed. It went from busy to tense. The line cooks, usually loud and swearing as they slammed pans around, went quiet. They were stealing glances at the clock, then at the doors, waiting for the verdict. It was a strange silence for a kitchen. The only sounds were the sizzle of the grill and the chop of knives against cutting boards, but the shouting had stopped. Everyone was holding their breath. Thomas stood in the center, his eyes fixed on the door. He wasn't worrying about the other 40 tickets hanging on the rail right now. All that mattered was table 4. In his head, he went through the preparation of the scallop again. Had the pan been hot enough? Yes. Did he add the butter at the right second so it didn't burn? Yes. Was the saffron foam too thick? He didn't think so. It was perfect. He knew it was perfect. But perfection to a chef and perfection to Anton Eads were two very different things. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Sweat trickled down Thomas's back, making him shiver despite the heat. He remembered why he became a chef. It wasn't for the glory. It was for that moment when the kitchen door opens and the waiter comes back with an empty plate. That was the only trophy he ever wanted. But tonight, the empty plate wasn't enough. He needed the reaction. He needed to know that Eads understood the language he was speaking with his food. The kitchen started to fill up with the smell of the next course. Roasted duck with cherry glaze. But Thomas didn't move. He was rooted to the spot. The sous chef, a tough woman named Alina, who had worked with Thomas for 5 years, came up beside him. "Chef," she said softly, nudging his arm. "We have fires on the grill. We need to move." Thomas blinked, snapping out of his trance, but he didn't turn to the grill. "I know," he whispered. Wait, just then, the double doors pushed open. The room went dead silent. It was Ben. He walked quickly, his face neutral, trying hard to be professional. He stopped at the pass and placed the silver tray down. Thomas looked down. The large white plate was sitting there in the center. It was clean. Not a scrap of sauce left, not a smear of foam, not a single flower petal disturbed. It was wiped clean, almost as if it had been washed. It was the kind of clean plate that people left when they didn't want the experience to end, scraping up the last bit of flavor with their forks. "Did he say anything?" Thomas asked, his voice sounding rougher than he intended. Ben swallowed hard and looked around the room at the other staff members, who were pretending not to listen while hanging on his every word. "He didn't call me over," Ben said. "He just kept eating." When he was done, he took a sip of water, looked at the empty plate for a second, and then put his napkin on the table. "He's still sitting there. He hasn't ordered the next course yet." A low ripple of murmurs went through the kitchen staff. An empty plate was good. Silence was usually bad. If he loved it, Eads would usually call the chef out immediately, demanding to know the secret or complimenting the balance of flavors. If he hated it, he would send it back. Just sitting there, in silence, was the most unnerving option of all. Thomas stared at the empty plate. It was a ghost of his hard work. He felt a knot form in his stomach. Maybe it was too salty. Maybe the texture was rubbery. Or maybe, just maybe, he was saving his judgment for the rest of the meal. The silence was like a heavy blanket smothering the kitchen's energy. "He hasn't left," Lena said, trying to sound optimistic. "That means he's staying for the show." Thomas nodded slowly, trying to convince himself. "Yeah, he's staying. Get back to work. Everyone, focus. Table 4 isn't the only hungry people in the city. Move." The shout in his voice woke everyone up. The sizzling and clattering resumed. The noise level went back up, and the kitchen went back to war. But the energy was different now. There was a shadow over the pass. Even as Thomas expertly seasoned a steak and checked the temperature on a rack of lamb, his mind kept drifting to the quiet corner booth where the most dangerous man in the food world was sitting. Waiting, watching, the service went on in a blur. Hours passed like minutes. Dishes went out. Dishes came back in dirty. Thomas worked on autopilot, his hands moving with a speed and grace that came from 20 years of practice. But he felt like he was walking a tightrope without a net. He couldn't shake the feeling that tonight wasn't over. In this industry, things rarely went smoothly. And when they did, it usually meant a storm was brewing just over the horizon. By the time the last main course left the kitchen, the night had deepened into late evening. The rush was finally dying down. The adrenaline that had been fueling Thomas began to fade, leaving him exhausted and aching in his feet. He looked around his kitchen. It was a mess. There were flour on the counters, piles of used pans soaking in the sinks, and the floor was slippery with grease. It looked like a battlefield, and Thomas felt like the soldier who had survived the charge, but didn't know if he had won the war. He grabbed a clean towel and wiped his face, walking toward the front of the house to check on the dining room status. He needed to know. He needed to see if Eads was still there. The silence from the start of the meal was haunting him. As he reached the swinging doors, he stopped. He could hear the low murmur of conversation from the diners, the clinking of glasses, and the soft music playing. It sounded peaceful. But as he pushed his hand against the door to step out, the Mater D rushed through from the other side. Nearly colliding with him, the Mater D looked pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. He grabbed Thomas's arm to steady himself. "Chef," the manager stammered, "you need to come out, Mr. Eads. He is asking for you." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, then start hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The moment of truth. "Is everything okay?" Thomas asked, his voice tight. "Did he complain about the main?" "No," the manager said, shaking his head slowly. "He hasn't touched the check. He says he won't leave until he speaks to you. And he said he has a challenge for you." Thomas stared at the manager, the words challenge swirling in his mind, mixing with his fatigue and anxiety. He wasn't ready for this. Whatever was coming next, he wasn't ready. But he straightened his back, took a deep breath, and prepared to walk through the doors. Thomas stood by the kitchen doors for a moment longer, trying to compose himself. He looked down at his hands. They were rough, the skin on his fingertips hardened and calloused from years of gripping knives, handling hot pans and scrubbing steel. He quickly wiped them on his apron, trying to remove the smell of garlic and seared meat. But it was a scent that lived deep in his skin now. It was the smell of his life. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the slightly cooler air from the dining room, and pushed through the swinging doors. The noise of the kitchen instantly faded, replaced by the low, elegant hum of the restaurant. Soft jazz was playing from hidden speakers, crystal glasses were clinking softly, and the room was filled with the murmur of satisfied conversations. The lighting was dim, designed to make the food look beautiful and the guests feel important. Thomas walked quickly, his eyes scanning the room. He passed tables where people were laughing, drinking wine, and enjoying their evening. He felt a strange disconnect from them. To them, this was a Friday night out, a time to relax. For him, this was a battlefield. And he was the general walking into enemy territory. He spotted the corner booth immediately. It was the best table in the house, tucked away from the main traffic, offering privacy and a view of the entire room. And there he was. Anton Eads. The critic didn't look like a monster. He looked like an older gentleman, perhaps in his 60s, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit. He sat with impeccable posture, sipping from a cup of espresso. Even from a distance, he had an air of authority about him. He wasn't eating anymore. He was just waiting. As Thomas approached, Eads looked up. His gaze was sharp, dissecting Thomas before he even said a word. It felt like being extache-rayed. Thomas stopped at the edge of the table. He forced a polite smile, though his heart was hammering so hard he was sure the critic could see it beating against his chest. "Mr. Eads," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm Thomas, the head chef. I was told you asked for me. I hope everything was to your liking tonight." He waited for the usual response. Maybe a compliment on the duck. Maybe a complaint about the seasoning. Maybe a stern lecture on the temperature of the wine. He was ready for all of that. He had spent his entire career preparing for feedback on his food. Anton Eads slowly placed his cup back on its saucer. The china made a soft clink that seemed to echo in the sudden silence between them. The critic looked at Thomas with a faint, almost amused smile playing on his lips. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a cat watching a mouse. "The food was competent," Eads said finally. His voice was smooth, calm, and terrifyingly controlled. The scallop was cooked correctly. The sauce was balanced. "You are a skilled technician, Thomas. I have eaten at many places this month, and your technical skills are above average." Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Competent. It wasn't groundbreaking or a masterpiece, but it wasn't terrible. It was safe. It was good enough. He felt his shoulders drop an inch. "Thank you, sir," Thomas said. "That is very kind of you to say. We strive for consistency." Consistency, Eads repeated the word, rolling it around in his mouth like he was tasting a foreign object. "Yes, you are certainly consistent. But do you know what is missing from your restaurant, Thomas? What is missing from this meal?" Thomas blinked, confused. He looked around the dining room. Everything looked perfect to him. The candles were lit, the flowers were fresh, the service was smooth. "I'm not sure, Sir," Thomas admitted slowly. "Please, tell me." "We are always looking to improve." Eads leaned forward slightly. The light from the candle caught the sharp angles of his face. He didn't look at the food on the table. He didn't look at the empty plates. He looked past Thomas, pointing a manicured finger toward the center of the room. "Soul," Eads said softly. "Passion. Surprise. The food was perfect, Thomas, but it was boring. It was like listening to a robot play a song. Every note was in the right place, but there was no heart behind it." Thomas felt the words like a slap in the face. Boring. He wanted to argue. He wanted to scream that he spent 18 hours a day in a hot kitchen, pouring his life into these dishes. He had missed birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays to make this food. How dare this man call it boring? But he stood there, silent, clenching his jaw. He knew better than to fight a critic. I see, Eads continued, leaning back in his chair. But I am a fair man. I understand that sometimes the routine of cooking can kill the spirit. I heard a rumor about you, Thomas. Something interesting. Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had no idea what the critic was talking about. He tried to keep his face blank, hiding his confusion. A rumor? Thomas asked. Yes, Eads nodded. I heard that before you decided to burn your fingertips in scalding oil, you were a student at the conservatory. That you were quite the pianist? The color drained from Thomas's face. It was a part of his life he had buried deep, a secret he hadn't thought about in years. He didn't talk about it to his staff, and he certainly didn't advertise it to his customers. He had left that world behind when he realized he couldn't make a living at it. When he realized that the pressure of the stage was too much for him. I took some lessons when I was younger, Thomas stammered. Just a hobby. It's been a long time. He'd let out a short, dry laugh. A hobby? My sources said you had talent. Real talent. And yet here I am, eating a meal that tastes like it was prepared by a machine. The critic turned his gaze back to Thomas, his eyes locking onto the chef's. I have a proposal for you. You see, I have to write my review tonight. I know you have the skill, but I need to know if you have the passion. I need to see if there is a real artist hiding under that chef's coat. Thomas's heart was pounding so hard now it actually hurt. He didn't like where this was going. He just wanted the man to leave so he could go back to the safety of his kitchen. What do you want me to do? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eads gestured again toward the far corner of the dining room. There, standing against the wall in the shadows, was a beautiful black baby grand piano. It was mostly decorative. Occasionally, they hired a trio to play on weekends, but tonight it sat silent and unused. Play for me, Eads commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. Sit down and play something. If you can play with even a fraction of the passion you claim to have, I will write that your restaurant is the best discovery of the year. But if you refuse, Eads paused, letting the threat hang in the air. If you refuse, or if you play terribly, I will have to assume that your food is as empty as your music. Thomas stared at him, his mouth open slightly. This was insane. He was a chef. He cooked food. He hadn't touched a piano seriously in 10 years. His hands were ruined, calloused, swollen, and scarred. He couldn't just sit down and perform like a circus animal. Thomas started, his voice shaking. I'm not a performer anymore. I'm a cook. My hands. Look at my hands. He held them up, showing the rough skin, the small burn mark on his wrist, the battered knuckles. Eads didn't even look at the hands. He just looked at Thomas with those cold, unblinking eyes. Great artists suffer for their work, don't they, Thomas? Prove to me that you haven't lost your soul to the kitchen. Show me that you are more than just a cook. The critic picked up his espresso cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip, signaling that the conversation was over. He was waiting. Thomas stood there, rooted to the spot. He felt the eyes of the few remaining waitstaff on him. He knew that if he walked away now, the restaurant would suffer. The review would be bad. He might have to let people go. He might lose his dream. But the thought of sitting at that piano, exposing a part of himself he had locked away, filled him with a terrifying dread. He felt like he was being asked to walk off a cliff. He looked back at the swinging doors. He could run. He could go back to the safety of the stoves, chop some onions, and pretend this never happened. But he knew he couldn't. The challenge had been issued, and the stakes were too high. With a heavy sigh that felt like he was giving up a piece of himself, Thomas nodded. One song, Thomas said quietly. We shall see, Eads replied, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Thomas turned away from the table and began walking toward the piano. The floor felt like it was shifting under his feet. With every step, he felt his heart beat faster. The room seemed to grow larger, the distance between the table and the instrument feeling like a mile. He could feel Eads watching him, boring a hole into his back. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready at all. The walk to the piano felt like the longest walk of Thomas's life. It was a distance of maybe 15 yards, but with every step his legs felt heavier, like he was walking through deep mud. The dining room seemed to stretch out, tables blurring into the background as he focused entirely on the black instrument sitting in the corner. It was a beautiful baby grand, polished to a high shine, reflecting the candlelight from the tables. Under normal circumstances, it was just a piece of furniture, a decoration for the room. Tonight it looked like a judge waiting to pass a sentence. He could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on him. The few diners left had stopped talking. The waitstaff, who were usually busy wiping down tables or resetting for the next day, had frozen in place. Even the bartender was leaning over the counter, watching. They all knew something was happening. They didn't know exactly what the challenge was. They knew Thomas was walking into the lion's den. As Thomas reached the piano, the sheer size of it hit him. It wasn't the upright piano he had practiced on as a teenager in his parents' dusty living room. This was a beast. He gently reached out and lifted the heavy fallboard that covered the keys. The wood was smooth and cool to the touch. As the lid slid back, the white and ivory keys were revealed, staring up at him like rows of teeth. Thomas sat down on the bench. It was hard and uncomfortable. He adjusted his position, instinctively trying to find the right posture, but his body didn't feel like his own anymore. He was wearing his chef's whites, the heavy coat stiff with starch. The sleeves were too long, getting in the way. He pushed them up roughly, exposing his forearms. He looked at his hands. They were hovering over the keys, trembling violently. These weren't the hands of a pianist. A pianist had long, slender fingers with smooth fingertips. Thomas's hands were scarred maps of his career. There was the burn mark on his left wrist from a spill of boiling stock. There was the small, permanent white scar on his right index finger from a mandolin slicer. The skin on his palms was thick and rough, hardened by years of gripping knife handles and hot pans. "I can't do this," he whispered to himself. The thought was loud and clear in his head. "My fingers are too stiff. I've forgotten everything." He stared at the keys, trying to remember a chord, a scale, anything. It had been 10 years. 10 years of roasting, braising, sautéing, and frying. He had replaced the language of music with the language of flavor. Now, standing on this stage, his mind was blank. It was like trying to speak a language he hadn't studied since grade school. The notes C, D, E, G meant nothing to him right now. They were just letters. He glanced over his shoulder toward the corner booth. Anton Eads was sitting there, swirling the last of his wine in his glass. He hadn't looked away. The critic wasn't checking his watch or looking bored. He was staring intensely, his expression unreadable. That stare was worse than any shouting. It was a silent demand for excellence. Thomas turned back to the piano. He felt a drop of sweat roll down his temple and hang off his nose, threatening to fall on the keys. He quickly wiped his face with his sleeve. The air in the room felt thick, hard to breathe. The silence was crushing. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, waiting silence, full of expectation. If he sat here for another minute without playing, he would humiliate himself. If he got up and walked away, the restaurant was doomed. Just play, he told himself. Just hit something. Make a noise. He took a deep, shaky breath and placed his right hand on the keys. His fingers felt clumsy, like sausages trying to do delicate work. He pressed down. The sound that came out was jarring. A loud, discordant clang that echoed through the quiet room. Someone at a nearby table flinched. Thomas flinched too. It was a terrible sound. It was the sound of a mistake. His heart hammered against his ribs. Panic. Pure panic. Wrong, his brain screamed. That was wrong. You're going to fail. Everyone is watching. You're a cook, not a musician. Who are you trying to fool? He pulled his hand back like the keys were hot. He sat there, staring at the white and black pattern, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He felt exposed. He felt like a fraud. He had built a life on being able to deliver, on being in control of his kitchen, and here he was, completely powerless. He remembered the feeling of being in the conservatory, the pressure of the exams, the feeling that he was never quite good enough, that the other students had a talent he couldn't touch. That feeling was back, choking him. He looked at his left hand. The knuckles were red and swollen from gripping a heavy sauté pan all night. He tried to curl his fingers into a relaxed curve, the way his old teacher used to yell at him to do, but they were stiff. They wanted to stay straight. "Play," a voice seemed to echo from the back of the room. It wasn't a shout, just a firm command from Eads. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut. He had to get out of his head. He had to stop thinking about the notes and the theory and the critics. He had to stop thinking about the burns and the cuts and the dinner service. He thought about the fear. He thought about the pressure. He thought about how much he hated being told he was competent but boring. He remembered a piece he used to play. A dark, moody piece by a composer who died young. It was full of anger and sadness. It was complicated, full of fast runs and heavy chords, but he knew it. Or at least his fingers used to know it. He didn't give himself time to think. He didn't give himself time to be afraid. He had just lifted both hands and brought them down hard on the keys. The first chord crashed through the room. It wasn't pretty. It was harsh, aggressive, and loud. It startled the room. A glass clinked loudly on a table. But it was music. It was a start. Thomas didn't stop. He forced his fingers to move to the next note, and the next. It was clumsy. His timing was off. He missed a note here, hit a wrong note there. The dissonance rang in his ears, making him wince internally. He felt like he was stumbling down a flight of stairs in the dark. But he didn't stop. He pushed harder, channeling his frustration into the keys. He wasn't trying to be perfect anymore. He was just trying to survive. He was playing with the brute force he used to hack through a chicken bone or smash a garlic clove. He wasn't a delicate musician. He was a laborer at the keys. Sweat was pouring down his face now, dripping onto the piano. His breath was coming in gasps. He could hear the mistakes piling up, a chaotic mess of sound. He waited for Eads to stop him. He waited for the sound of a chair scraping the floor as the critic stood up to leave. He waited for the mockery. But then, something strange happened. About a minute in, his hands stopped fighting him. The muscle memory buried deep under 10 years of culinary repetition began to wake up. His fingers remembered the pattern. They found the rhythm. The stumbling smoothed out just a little. The sound coming from the piano shifted. It went from a chaotic banging to something raw and powerful. It wasn't technically perfect. It was rough around the edges, rushed in places, heavy-handed in others, but it had energy. It had life. It sounded like a man fighting for his life. Thomas opened his eyes, but he didn't look at his hands. He looked straight ahead, unseeing. He stopped hearing the restaurant. He stopped seeing the critics. He was alone in a storm of sound, pouring every ounce of stress, fear, and exhaustion from the last 10 years into the instrument. He wasn't playing for a review anymore. He was playing to let the scream out that he had been holding in for a decade. The vibration shook through the bench, up his legs and into his chest, rattling his very bones. He was terrified, but for the first time that night, he was moving. The piano was no longer just an object made of wood and wire. Under Thomas's hands, it felt like a living, breathing beast. The initial shock of the performance was wearing off, replaced by a strange, hypnotic flow. Thomas wasn't thinking about notes or scales anymore. He wasn't worrying about whether his pinky was curved correctly or if his wrist was loose enough. All the technical rules his old teachers had drilled into his head were thrown out the window. He was playing with a kind of violence that surprised even him. In the kitchen, when the dinner rush hit, you didn't gently coax the food into existence. You attacked it. You chopped, you seared, you flipped, and you moved with a relentless, aggressive rhythm. That was the only language Thomas had spoken fluently for 10 years. Now, without him realizing it, that language was pouring out through his fingers. The piece he was attempting something. Complex and Dark by Chopin was meant to be played with elegance and grace. But Thomas was playing it like he was seasoning a steak. He hit the keys hard, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings of the dining room. Every wrong note he hit, every moment where his fingers fumbled and got tangled, he just pushed through it. He didn't stop to apologize to the music. He didn't try to fix it. He just kept going, forcing the song to submit to him, and it was working. The music that was coming out wasn't the polished, perfect sound of a concert hall. It was rough. It was gritty. It sounded like a fight. It sounded like someone sweating over a hot stove, someone exhausted but refusing to quit. There was a raw urgency to the sound that grabbed you by the throat and demanded you listen. It was messy, but it was undeniably alive. Thomas's eyes were closed tight, squeezing out sweat that ran down into his ears. He could feel the blisters on his fingertips rubbing against the ivory keys. Usually calluses protect a chef, making his hands tough. But on the piano keys, those same calluses felt like clumsy gloves, deadening the sensation. Yet this lack of sensitivity seemed to help him in a weird way. He wasn't feeling the delicate vibration of the string. He was pounding out the rhythm, relying on muscle memory and brute force. The melody swelled, rising to a crescendo that filled the entire restaurant. The deep bass notes rumbled like the giant ovens in the kitchen, shaking the floorboards. The high notes shrieked like the steam escaping a pressure valve. Thomas's body was swaying now, caught in the trance. His shoulders, usually hunched forward from years of leaning over cutting boards, were rolling back as he slammed into the chords. He thought about the day he left music school. He remembered the feeling of failure, of looking at his hands and thinking they weren't good enough, that he wasn't talented enough to compete with the prodigies. He had run to the kitchen because the kitchen was honest. If you worked hard and followed the recipe, the food tasted good. There was no subjectivity. But music. Music felt like a judgment on his soul. Tonight, playing for the man who held his career in the palm of his hand, Thomas realized he had been wrong. Cooking wasn't just mechanics. The reason he was still here, 10 years later, working 18-hour days, wasn't because he liked chopping vegetables. It was because he loved creating something that made people feel something. And as he hammered out the next series of thundering chords, he realized that cooking and playing weren't so different after all. Both were just ways of shouting without using words. He was getting tired now. His forearms were burning, the muscles screaming from the unaccustomed movement. He wasn't used to holding his arms up like this. He was used to the heavy downward pressure of a knife. His breath was coming in ragged gasps, matching the frantic tempo of the music. He felt dizzy, the room spinning behind his closed eyelids, but he didn't dare stop. He poured every frustration of the last decade into the song. He played for the lonely Christmas Eve spent peeling potatoes. He played for the sore feet and the aching back. He played for the customers who sent food back without tasting it. He played for the fear that he had wasted his life, that he was just a cook and not an artist. All that anger and sadness poured out of him, vibrating through the piano and crashing over the silent audience. In the corner of the room, Anton Eads sat perfectly still. He hadn't taken his eyes off the chef. The critic had seen thousands of musicians in his life. He had seen virtuosos who could play faster than the eye could see, technicians who never hit a wrong note. But he had rarely seen anything like this. This wasn't a performance. It was a confession. The imperfections, the slightly rushed tempo, the heavy-handed strikes, the occasional miss notably, made it more real. It sounded like a human being fighting to be heard. The music began to slow down. Thomas was reaching the end of his strength. The chaotic rush of notes settled into a slower, more melancholic rhythm. The anger was turning into exhaustion, a deep, aching sadness. His fingers were dragging across the keys now, heavy as lead. He was playing the final passage. The notes cascading down like rain running down a window pane. The dining room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen through the swinging doors. No one was eating. No one was drinking. Every person in the room was leaning forward, caught in the gravity of the moment. Even the servers stood frozen, trays held loosely in their hands forgotten. Thomas's vision was blurring. He felt lightheaded. He knew he had to finish it, one way or another. He summoned the last bit of energy he had left in his body. The same reserve he tapped into on a Saturday night when the orders were piling up and he wanted to collapse. He placed both hands on the keys for the final, resolving chords. He took a deep breath, his chest heaving, and brought his hands down. Bum, bum, bum. The 3 final chords rang out, deep and resonant. He held the last chord, letting the sound vibrate through the floor, through the bench, and into his bones. He pressed the sustain pedal with his foot, keeping the sound hanging in the air, refusing to let it go. It was a moment of suspension, a moment of pure stillness in the middle of the chaos. Then, slowly he lifted his hands. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence from before. It was a charged silence, an electric quiet that buzzed with energy. The sound of the piano faded away, leaving a ghost of the melody in the air. Thomas sat there, staring at his hands resting on his lap. They were trembling violently, shaking so hard he had to clasp them together to make them stop. He was covered in sweat. His shirt was soaked through, sticking to his back. His heart was beating so hard he thought it might bruise his ribs. He didn't turn around. He couldn't face the room. He felt raw, like he had just peeled off a layer of his skin and showed the world what was underneath. He felt exposed. He was terrified that he had just made a complete fool of himself, that the critic was standing up right now, putting on his coat, and preparing to destroy him in the morning paper. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the murmurs to start, waiting for the polite applause, or even worse, the awkward cough of a disappointed audience. For a long 10 seconds, no one moved. The air in the room felt heavy, suspended in time. Thomas held his breath, counting the heartbeats in his chest. 1, 2, 3. The silence stretched on, agonizing and endless. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. They hated it, he thought. I messed it up. It's over, Thomas sat frozen on the bench, his hands trembling in his lap. The last echo of the piano note had faded into the air, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than before. It was a thick, suffocating quiet. To him, it sounded like failure. He was sure he had just humiliated himself. He remembered the missed notes, the clumsy transitions, the way he had pounded the keys like they were a piece of tough meat. He had just poured his heart out in the most undignified way possible. And now, he had to face the consequences. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the sound of a chair scraping, a sigh of boredom, or a sarcastic comment. He imagined the critic Anton Eads standing up and walking out without a word, leaving behind a check and a sentence of doom for the restaurant. In his mind, the review was already written. The chef tries to be an artist, but he is just a tired man making noise. Then, a single sound broke the silence. It was the sharp clink of a metal spoon hitting a crystal glass from the back of the room. Before Thomas could even process what that meant, another sound followed. Then another. It was clapping. It started slow, tentative at first, but then it grew louder and faster. It wasn't the polite, bored applause of people who were just being nice. It was rhythmic and strong. Thomas opened his eyes and turned his head slightly. He saw the waitstaff standing near the kitchen doors, smiling and clapping. He saw the few remaining tables of guests turn toward him, some with tears in their eyes, others smiling widely. They weren't clapping because he was a virtuoso. They were clapping because it was real. They had felt the sweat and the struggle in the music. They had seen a man let go of his defenses and show them something raw. But the only applause Thomas cared about was coming from the corner booth. Slowly, Thomas pushed himself up from the piano bench. His legs felt weak, like jelly, and he had to grab the edge of the piano to steady himself. He was soaked in sweat, his chef's coat clinging to his back, his hair messy. He felt drained, empty, but also strangely light. He took a deep breath, smoothed his apron out of habit, and turned to face the critic. Anton Eads was standing. The older man buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate, slow movements. He didn't look bored. He didn't look disappointed. He had a small, strange smile on his face, a look of genuine surprise. He walked over to the pass, where the manager was waiting nervously. Eads pulled out a leather wallet and placed a stack of cash on the table, far more than the meal cost, then turned his attention to Thomas. Thomas walked toward him, his heart hammering against his ribs all over again. He felt like a defendant walking to the judge to hear the verdict. He stopped a few feet away, unsure if he should offer his hand or just wait. The technical execution was frankly a disaster, Eads said. His voice was calm, cutting through the noise of the clapping room. Thomas felt his stomach drop. He opened his mouth to apologize, to make an excuse, but Eads held up a hand to stop him. Your timing was erratic. You missed half the transitions in the middle section. You hit the keys with the grace of a butcher, the critic continued, listing the flaws. Thomas hung his head. I know, sir. I told you I wasn't ready. I'm sorry. But, Eads said, stepping closer, his voice dropping an octave. I haven't heard anything that honest in a restaurant in 10 years. You didn't play the music, Thomas. You attacked it. You bled on it. Thomas looked up, confused. I thought you wanted perfection. Perfection is boring, Eads said sharply. I can get a perfect scallop in 50 different restaurants. I can hear a perfect sonata at the Symphony Hall. But tonight I heard a man who is fighting. You played with the same anger and passion that you put into your food, but tonight you let it out of the cage. You stopped being a machine and became an artist. The critic reached out and, to Thomas's shock, shook his hand. It was a firm grip. The food you served me tonight was perfect, Eads said, but it was safe. You were protecting yourself. The piano. The piano was dangerous. It was raw. That is what I have been looking for. I don't care if your fingers are stiff. I care if your heart is beating. Thomas let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding for a decade. He felt tears pricking the corners of his eyes, tiredness overwhelming him. So, does this mean? Thomas started, his voice cracking. I'm going to write the review tonight, Eads said, adjusting his cuffs. And I'm not going to write about the sauce. I'm going to write about the chef who plays with knives and keys. I'll tell them that this place isn't just about eating. It's about feeling. That is rare, Thomas. Don't lose it. The critic turned and walked toward the door, the crowd parting to let him through. As he reached the exit, he paused and looked back one last time. Keep practicing. Your left hand is still weak. With that, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him. The restaurant erupted. It wasn't the quiet, classy atmosphere anymore. It was a buzz of excitement. The staff rushed over, patting Thomas on the back, asking him if he was okay, telling him how amazing it was. Alina, his sous chef, came up and gave him a rare hug. You idiot, she whispered, laughing. You can actually play. Thomas smiled weakly. I can't play. I just played. He walked back into the kitchen. It felt different now. The steel, the heat, the noise, it was all the same, but his perspective had shifted. He looked at the stove, at the prep station, at the knives. He realized that for years he had been treating his cooking like a chore, a technical job he had to do perfectly to survive. He had forgotten why he started cooking in the first place. It wasn't for the stars or the reviews. It was to make people feel something, just like the music did. 2 days later, the review came out. Thomas arrived at the restaurant early, like always. He turned on the lights, fired up the ovens, and put on his apron. He walked to the front counter where the newspaper was waiting. His hands shook as he unfolded it. He scanned the pages until he saw his restaurant's name. The title of the piece wasn't a perfect meal, wasn't the best scallops in town. The headline read, The Chef Who Bleeds Melody. Thomas sat down on a crate and read. The review was glowing, but it was strange. It talked about the roughness of the piano performance, but it called it brave. Compared the food to the music honest, hearty, and full of soul. It said that the food wasn't just cooked. It was fought for. It ended with a prediction. Asterisk, this place is not just a restaurant. It is a destination for anyone who wants to remember what passion tastes like. Asterisk. Thomas folded the newspaper and put it in his pocket. He stood up and walked to the piano, which stood silent in the corner of the empty dining room. He lifted the fallboard, exposing the keys again. He sat down. He didn't play a masterpiece. He didn't try to perform. He just played a simple scale, letting his fingers get used to the feeling again. It felt stiff, but it also felt right. He realized he didn't have to choose between his two loves. He could bring the music into the kitchen and the kitchen into the music. He could be rough and imperfect and still be great. From that night on, the menu changed. It became bolder, riskier, and sometimes late at night, after the last customer left and the dishes were done, the staff would hear a sound coming from the dining room. It was the sound of the piano, accompanied by the clinking of glasses and the quiet hum of a chef who had finally found his rhythm. He wasn't just a cook anymore. He was a creator, in and out of the kitchen. And the critics? They couldn't get enough of it.